The ash chimes? Elias Thorne had always sought quiet places to untangle the knots of his narratives. His latest novel, a dense historical piece, demanded a particular kind of silence, one deep enough to hear the whispers of the past. Oakhaven, nestled in a valley that seemed to have been overlooked by modern mapmakers, promised just that. The online advertisement for the rental cottage had been brief. Solitude seekers retreat. Rustic charm. Perched by the old church grounds. The accompanying photograph showed a small, stone-built structure, ivy-kissed and looking as though it had grown from the earth itself. The drive had been long, the final hour spent on a winding road that narrowed progressively, trees pressing in from either side, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dim, leafy tunnel. When he finally emerged into Oakhaven proper, it was like stepping back several decades. The town consisted of a single main street, buildings of weathered timber and stone leaning companionably against one another. There was a general store with a faded sign, a post office that looked like it serviced 3 customers a week, and a surprising number of drawn curtains, even in the mid-afternoon. People, when he saw them, offered curt nods, their eyes lingering a moment too long before sliding away. It wasn't hostility, precisely, more a deep-seated weariness, a communal reluctance to engage. His cottage stood a little apart from the town, as advertised, up a slight incline where the road petered out into a dirt track. Beyond it, stark against the gray sky, were the ruins. Charred stone walls, a jagged, broken arch where a window once held vibrant glass, and the skeletal remains of a belfry, pointing a blackened finger towards the heavens. The air here was different, cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth, old stone, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible trace of wood smoke, though no fires were burning. The cottage itself was charming in a rough-hewn way. Low ceilings, thick walls, a stone fireplace large enough to stand in. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through small, deep-set windows. Elias unpacked, setting up his laptop on a sturdy oak table, arranging his research notes, trying to impose his own order on the ancient stillness of the place. He made a simple supper, the silence of the cottage broken only by the clink of his fork against the plate, and the sigh of the wind outside. It was perfect, he told himself. The kind of quiet that would let the words flow. Later, as darkness fully enveloped the small valley, he sat at the table, trying to write. The wind had picked up, whispering around the eaves, rattling a loose shutter somewhere. He found his concentration wavering, his gaze drifting to the window that overlooked the church ruins. The moon, a pale sliver, cast long, distorted shadows, making the skeletal belfry seem almost alive, swaying slightly. He shivered, though the room was not cold, and turned back to his screen. He must have dozed off, head resting on his arms, because he jerked awake with a start. The digital clock on his laptop read 12 a.m. And then he heard it. Bells. Not the cheerful, clanging bells of a vibrant parish. These were slow, sonorous, each peal echoing with a profound melancholy that seemed to settle deep in his bones. Dawn. 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 The sound was clear, impossibly clear, as if the church stood whole and hale just beyond his window, its great bronze bells swinging in the night. Elias froze, listening. There were perhaps a dozen chimes, each one fading slowly into the sighing wind before the next began. He pushed back his chair, went to the window. The ruins were as they had been, dark, silent, broken. No light, no movement. Just the jagged silhouette against the faintly luminous sky. It had to be the wind, he reasoned. The wind playing tricks through the hollow stones of the belfry, creating an illusion of sound. Or perhaps there was another church, miles away, its sound carried on the night air, amplified by the valley's strange acoustics. Yes, that must be it. It was an old house, too. Old houses made noises, creaks and groans that could be misinterpreted by a tired mind in an unfamiliar setting. He tried to dismiss it, to return to his work, but the resonance of those chimes lingered, an unsettling vibration in the air, a question mark etched into the profound silence that followed. He found he could no longer focus. The quiet he had sought now felt charged, expectant. He eventually gave up on writing for the night, the image of the ruined belfry and the impossible sound of its midnight toll imprinted on his mind. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and disturbed by dreams he couldn't quite recall, only a lingering feeling of unease that clung to him like the damp morning mist. The morning sun did little to dispel the curious weight that had settled over Elias. He made coffee, the ritual a small comfort, and decided a walk into Oak Haven might clear his head. Perhaps he could subtly inquire about nearby churches, gauge the distance, and satisfy the logical part of his brain that insisted on a rational explanation for the midnight bells. The town seemed even quieter by day. He entered the general store, its bell tinkling with a cheerfulness that felt jarringly out of place. An older woman with sharp, observant eyes watched him from behind the counter. He bought a newspaper he didn't intend to read and a few groceries. "Morning," he offered. "Just moved into the cottage by the old St. Michael's grounds." The woman's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to narrow almost imperceptibly. "Is that so?" she said. It wasn't a question. "Beautiful spot," Elias continued, trying for casual. "Though I was wondering, are there any other churches nearby? Active ones, I mean. Heard some bells last night, thought they might have carried." A beat of silence. The woman slowly wiped an already clean counter with a cloth. "No other churches for 20 miles. She stated flatly. "And St. Michael's hasn't had bells to ring in 50 years. Not since the fire." Her gaze flicked towards him, then away. "Wind plays tricks up there by the ruins." Elias felt a small chill. "Right. The fire. Tragic, I imagine." "It was a long time ago," she said, her voice closing the subject. He paid for his items and left, the woman's unblinking stare following him out the door. The encounter left him more unsettled than before. No one else he passed on the street offered more than a cursory glance. The reticence of the townsfolk was palpable, a shared, unspoken agreement to keep outsiders at arm's length. Later that afternoon, drawn by an undeniable curiosity, Elias walked to the ruins of St. Michael's. Up close, the devastation was more apparent. Massive stone blocks, blackened by soot, lay tumbled like a giant's discarded playthings. Weeds and stubborn wildflowers grew in cracks, a tenacious green against the grim gray and black. He stepped through a collapsed archway into what must have been the nave. The air was still, heavy with the scent he now recognized more clearly, not just old smoke, but something acrid, like sorrow turned to ash. He found a fragment of melted glass, once perhaps part of a vibrant window, now a dull, opaque lump. In a sheltered corner, near the base of the belfry tower, he saw a child's toy, a small, crudely carved wooden horse, its paint faded and peeling, half buried in the debris. That night, he was determined to be ready. He set up his phone to record, placing it on the windowsill. He made sure he was wide awake, coffee still warm beside him, as the minutes ticked towards midnight. The silence in the cottage was absolute, amplifying every tiny creak of the old timbers, every rustle of leaves outside. Then, precisely as the clock on his laptop changed to 12 a.m., the bells began again. Dawn. 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 Clearer this time, he thought, or perhaps he was just more attuned to them. There was a definite cadence, a mournful rhythm that seemed to vibrate not just in the air but within his own chest. He stared out at the belfry, a dark void against the night sky, and saw nothing. He focused on his phone, the red recording light a small, brave beacon. When the last chime faded, he snatched up the phone, his fingers trembling slightly. He played back the recording. Nothing. Only the faint hiss of static, the sound of his own quiet breathing, and once, the distant hoot of an owl. The bells were not there. A cold dread began to seep into him, far more profound than the initial unease. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a distant church. He was hearing something that, by all rational accounts, did not exist. Sleep was impossible that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every shadow seeming to lengthen, every sound the old house made taking on a sinister quality. He found himself researching the Oakhaven church fire online, but information was scarce. A few old news reports, terse and factual. St. Michael's Church destroyed in blaze. Date, October 27th, 50 years prior. Investigation inconclusive. Multiple fatalities mentioned, but no names, no details. The lack of information was almost as unsettling as the phantom sounds. The town, it seemed, was very good at keeping its secrets buried. The following days settled into a pattern of strained normalcy punctuated by nocturnal dread. Elias attempted to work, but the words felt hollow, his concentration shattered by the anticipation of midnight. The bells continued their nightly toll, each peal weaving itself deeper into the fabric of his unease. He started to feel perpetually tired, the lack of restful sleep leaving dark circles under his eyes and a tremor in his hands. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that he couldn't simply ignore what was happening. He decided to try a different approach with the townsfolk. Subtlety had failed. Perhaps a more direct, albeit gentle, persistence was needed. He found his opportunity at the small post office, where an elderly man named Mr. Abernathy was meticulously sorting mail. Mr. Abernathy, with his kind, watery eyes and stooped shoulders, seemed less guarded than the others. Elias collected a non-existent parcel he'd pretended to expect. "Mr. Abernathy," he began, his voice carefully neutral. "I've been staying up at the cottage by St. Michael's. I know the church burned down a long time ago, but I keep hearing things. Bells specifically. At midnight." The old man stopped his sorting, his hands, gnarled with age, resting on a stack of letters. He didn't look at Elias immediately, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the dusty window. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Elias waited, not daring to speak. Finally, Mr. Abernathy sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Some sounds, they linger," he said, his voice low and raspy. "Echoes. Oakhaven is full of them, if you know how to listen." He turned then, his blue eyes surprisingly sharp. "That fire, it wasn't just wood and stone that burned, young man. It was the heart of this town." Elias leaned forward slightly. "What happened?" "The reports are so vague." Mr. Abernathy hesitated, glancing towards the door as if fearing interruption. "It was a Saturday night," he whispered. 50 years ago next month. All Hallows' Eve. The congregation was inside for a special late service. The doors, they were barred from the outside. No one knows for sure who did it, or why. Some said it was outsiders, troublemakers. Others... He trailed off, his gaze becoming distant, haunted. Others whispered of darker things. Of a curse or a debt owed. "And the bells?" Elias prompted gently. "They rang that night," Mr. Abernathy said, his voice barely audible. "They rang as the fire took hold. Some say the pastor, Reverend Blackwood, kept ringing them, a desperate alarm, until the ropes burned through and the belfry itself was engulfed. Now they say the bells ring for them. For the ones we lost. A reminder." Or a call. He shook his head slowly. Best not to dwell on it. Some doors are best left unopened. Elias left the post office with a knot of ice in his stomach. A call? To whom? For what? The vague unease he'd felt had now solidified into a specific, chilling dread. He felt the eyes of the town on him more acutely than ever, no longer just wary, but suspicious, as if his questions were stirring something they desperately wanted to remain dormant. That night, the bells seemed different again. Not just mournful, but imbued with a strange, discordant energy. He thought he could almost discern a melody within their tolling, something fragmented and deeply unsettling, like a familiar hymn played backwards or in a minor key that twisted its comfort into something menacing. He found himself standing at the window, staring at the ruins, feeling an almost irresistible pull towards them, a morbid curiosity that warred with a primal instinct to flee. The cottage itself seemed to conspire with the night. A floorboard creaked in the empty hallway. A dish rattled softly in the kitchen cupboard, though there was no draught. Once he heard a sound like soft weeping, so faint he almost convinced himself it was the wind, but it was too distinctly human, too laden with sorrow. He was no longer just hearing the bells. He was feeling the presence of the past, a cold, sorrowful weight pressing in on him from all sides. His solitude, once a comfort, now felt like a vulnerability, an isolation that left him utterly exposed to whatever lingered in the shadowed ruins of St. Michael's. Elias's novel lay untouched. His research notes gathered dust. Oakhaven, and the mystery of its phantom bells, had consumed him. He found himself spending more and more time at the ruins of St. Michael's, sifting through the charred debris, driven by a compulsion he didn't fully understand. The townsfolk now actively avoided him. If he entered the general store and someone was there, they would abruptly finish their business and leave. He saw curtains twitch as he walked down the street, felt the weight of unseen eyes. He was the outsider, the one stirring the ashes of a past they had tried so hard to bury. His explorations of the ruins became more methodical, almost archaeological. He cleared away rubble from the base of the belfry tower, his hands raw and scraped. It was there, wedged between two massive, fire-blackened stones, that he found it, a small, leather-bound diary, its cover scorched and brittle, its pages fused together in places by heat and time. He carried it back to the cottage as if it were a sacred relic, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. With painstaking care, using a thin palette knife, he managed to separate some of the pages. The ink was faded, the handwriting small and spidery, but parts were legible. It belonged to a young woman named Elara, dated in the weeks leading up to the fire. She wrote of the town, of her love for St. Michael's, but also of a growing unease. She mentioned Reverend Blackwood, a man of stern countenance and fiery sermons, who spoke increasingly of sin and retribution. There were entries about strange occurrences, unsettling whispers in the night, a feeling of being watched even within the church's supposedly hallowed walls. One entry, dated just days before the fire, sent a shiver down Elias's spine. The Reverend spoke today of an old darkness, one that Oakhaven was founded to keep at bay. He said it stirs, drawn by the turning of the year. He intends a special service, a vigil on All Hallows' Eve, to fortify our souls against it. He says the church bells must ring out to consecrate the valley, to push back the encroaching shadows. I am afraid. There is a new fervor in his eyes, a light that is not entirely holy. The bells, then, were not just a memorial. They were intended as a ward, a defense. Or perhaps, Elias thought with a dawning horror, they had become something else entirely. A signal, twisted from its original purpose. Mr. Abernathy had said the doors were barred from the outside. What if the old darkness, Elara wrote of, wasn't kept out, but had been invited in, or had found a willing instrument in the fanatical reverend. That night, as midnight approached, the air in the cottage grew heavy, almost suffocating. The usual creaks and groans of the old house were amplified, joined by newer, more disturbing sounds. A low, almost subaudible hum seemed to emanate from the direction of the ruins. He heard, or thought he heard, the faint crackle of flames, a ghostly echo of the inferno 50 years past. And beneath it, a soft, collective sigh, like the last breath of many souls. When the bells began, they were louder, more resonant than ever before. But it wasn't just the bells. He could hear voices woven into their tolling, faint, ethereal whispers, too indistinct to be words, yet undeniably present. He stood rooted to the spot, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. The pull towards the ruins was stronger now, a palpable force tugging at him. He felt as though the belfry itself was calling to him, demanding his presence. His rational mind screamed at him to stay inside, to lock the doors, to hide. But another part of him, the part that had been captivated by the mystery, the part that felt an inexplicable connection to the tragedy, urged him forward. He found himself walking towards the door, his movements stiff, almost involuntary. The line between his own will and the influence of the place was blurring. He was beginning to fear not just for his safety, but for his sanity. Was this what Oakhaven did to people who listened too closely to its echoes? The calendar page on his desk showed October 31st. All Hallows' Eve. 50 years to the day since St. Michael's had burned, since its congregation had met their terrible end. Elias hadn't needed the calendar. A palpable tension had been building in Oakhaven for days, a suffocating blanket of dread that seemed to emanate from the very soil. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed all reason, that tonight would be different. Tonight, the veil would be at its thinnest. He hadn't planned to go to the ruins. All day, he had fought the insidious pull, the whispered invitations that seemed to ride on every gust of wind. He'd packed a small bag, intending to leave Oakhaven at dusk, to drive until the town and its haunted silhouette were miles behind him. But as twilight bled into a starless, oppressive night, he found himself unable to start the car. His limbs felt heavy, his will sapped. The cottage, once a refuge, now felt like a cage, holding him hostage until the appointed hour. Minutes before midnight he was outside, walking the familiar path to the churchyard. The air was unnaturally still, cold, and carried the heavy scent of ash and something else, something ancient and cloying, like disturbed earth from a long-forgotten grave. He moved as if in a dream, his feet finding their way through the darkness with an eerie sureness. He reached the edge of the ruins just as the first chime of midnight began to toll from the phantom belfry. Dawn. It was deeper tonight, more powerful, a sound that vibrated through the ground, up his legs, into the very core of his being. Dawn. With each peal, the world around him seemed to shift, to waver. Then he saw them. At first, it was like a heat haze rising from the blackened stones, a shimmering distortion in the air. But as the bells continued their solemn, inexorable count, the shimmering coalesced into forms. Figures. Dozens of them, standing within the ruined nave, their outlines indistinct, translucent, glowing with a faint, sorrowful luminescence. Men, women, children, their features blurred, their spectral garments flowing as if stirred by a phantom breeze. The congregation of St. Michael's returned. They were not looking at him, not yet. They faced the broken altar, their heads bowed, some swaying slightly to the rhythm of the tolling bells. He could hear them now, not just the whispers he'd heard before, but a low, mournful chanting, the words just out of reach, like a half-remembered prayer. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the smell of smoke intensified, so strong he could almost taste it, feel the phantom heat on his skin. Then, from the direction of the ruined chancel, another figure emerged, taller than the others, its form darker, more defined. Reverend Blackwood. Even in this ethereal state, there was an aura of terrible authority about him, his head held high, his spectral gaze fixed on some unseen point. He raised a shadowy hand, and the chanting of the congregation seemed to grow in intensity, their sorrow tinged with an undercurrent of fear. Elias wanted to run, to scream, to break the horrifying spell that held him captive. But he was frozen, a spectator to a tragedy replaying itself, or perhaps, something worse, a ritual. As the 12th bell faded into an echoing silence, the figures stirred. One by one they began to turn. Not towards the altar, not towards their spectral pastor, but towards him. Their faces, still indistinct, now seemed to possess eyes, hollow sockets that fixed upon him with an unnerving intensity. The chanting died away, replaced by a collective sigh that sounded like the wind rushing through 1,000 empty graves. They began to move, slowly, gliding over the rubble-strewn ground, their forms flickering like dying embers. They were coming for him. What did they want? Release? An end to their endless cycle? Or did they seek to add another soul to their sorrowful assembly, another voice to their midnight lament? He saw Lara amongst them, her diary-scribed fears made manifest, her translucent hand reaching out. It was the sight of the child's wooden horse, lying near his feet where he'd seen it days before, that finally broke his paralysis. It looked so small, so innocent amidst the spectral horror. He didn't know what came over him, but he bent, snatched it up, and hurled it with all his might towards the approaching figures, towards the dark shape of Reverend Blackwood. The horse passed through them as if they were smoke, clattering against the far wall of the ruin. But the act, the small defiance, seemed to momentarily disrupt their advance. In that instant, Elias turned and fled. He ran blindly, stumbling over rocks and roots, the sounds of the midnight congregation, a rising chorus of whispers and sorrowful cries, pursuing him through the darkness. He didn't look back until he reached his car, his breath tearing at his lungs, his body shaking uncontrollably. He drove out of Oakhaven without a glance in his rearview mirror, the accelerator pressed to the floor. He drove for hours, until the sun began to paint the eastern sky with pale light. Elias never finished his novel. He moved cities, tried to build a new life, but Oakhaven remained with him, a permanent shadow on his soul. He never spoke of what he saw, knowing no one would believe him. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the silence of his apartment was at its deepest, he would hear it, the faint, melancholic echo of bells. And he would know that the congregation of St. Michael's was still waiting, their sorrowful chimes a reminder of a darkness that lingered, just beyond the veil of the world. The ash chimes, he called them, forever ringing in the quietest corners of his mind. He understood, with a certainty that brought no comfort, that some places never let you go.